Okay, I usually like to try and make an effort to get to the point really fast in the beginning. Um, right now, that's a little bit difficult to do because it's difficult to sort out the most important point when there's a bunch of really important rambling that happened around that point. But if I had to move quickly and say cut to the chase about this is that democracy and or the free market, look at those and then look at the division of labor or the disintegration of the fight between good and evil. uh, Look at the way that fight used to look and look at the way it looks under a modern lens, right? So instead of thinking of what happens on the battlefield with in the old days with swords and shields and blood and cuts and stuff like that, what we want to be thinking of now is the way you spend your money, right? And you want to think about that in terms of like sitting in your living room and tapping on your phone, right? So now we're calling those the same thing. I know that there's an intensity level disparity, but that's exactly what I want you to think of as the glorious thing. The intensity level disparity is exactly what I want to be the point of this conceptual grab today. Uh, the point is, okay, so democracy. Okay, really quick, democracy can fail if the mass of people are uneducated. Okay, basically, if uneducated is a problematic word, then if the majority of people make a poor decision, then that's a weakness of democracy, right? But in general speaking, like that's difficult to do. It's not that it never happens, but it's very difficult to accomplish that. And I want you to look at evil, and I want you to kind of I want you to look at what democracy makes evil do. You know, first of all, evil requires a victim. So democracy is funny the way it makes evil appeal to the majority of people and how it makes evil act, right? Instead of like, you know, sticking a gun at somebody or sticking a knife at somebody and saying, "Give me all your money or I'll hurt you," you know, uh, there's law enforcement in place or whatever, you know, and then like, if you want to achieve larger scale evil, I mean, that's still possible. The whole stick up thing, that's still possible and whatnot, but the whole invention or discovery of law enforcement as a remedy for that is, predates democracy, but is very valuable. Ramble, ramble, ramble. My apologies. The point is that in order to achieve widespread evil, uh, it makes the intent the evildoer with the intent of doing evil. It makes the person with the intent of doing evil sort of like beg and plead. You know, it's gotta be it's gotta be difficult for somebody who has the intention to do evil to have to appeal to reason in order to achieve that end. You know what I mean? Because the most easiest and obvious way to achieve evil is the stick up. That's the small scale, the granular level form of evil, and it's the most uh, mundane form. So, if you're looking to be a high achiever in the evil spectrum, and like, that's not an unheard of thing. There's competition that exists within that world. So if you want to achieve evil, democracy is funny because the most natural and easiest thing for evil to resort to is obviously force. Look at the stick up. But democracy makes evil resort to reason. And I just find that very funny. And I hope that anybody listening to this can find the humor in that as well, because to make evil use reason is very embarrassing. It's very embarrassing because reason is, we all have the potential for good or evil, and we all have desires to various magnitudes on various subjects in different amounts in those in different fields. We have, if we can't see reason, though, if we can't see how reason guides us in this particular field or that particular situation or whatever, our natural desires or our most immediate desires may not be what is exactly reasonable once the more longer term is considered. But, there's accidental evil, and then there's just laziness. I don't feel like being good today. And then there's like, seriously, like I want to do something evil. And, on the small scale, maybe somebody who is good for the most part knows this feeling and, just wants to exert their power over something. Like, maybe you've, it takes an effort to not be evil sometimes. I can imagine like somebody who's very impressionable, and it's very aggravating sometimes that they are so impressionable. So, you think like, just using that against them will teach them a lesson or something like that. You slip up like that way. But if you want to teach them a lesson doing that, then look at what you've become yourself. But having the time to, in the moment, think of those things. You know what I'm saying? Okay, so we all have the potential for good and evil. Takes a while to come to the point after a distraction, and then you got to remember where you were when you left for that distraction. Democracy makes the evil person use reason. And, I just imagine that that's disgusting for the evil person to have to do. But anyways, that's not the point either. The point is to look at you in your living room buying something on your phone, and look at the whole world doing the same thing. Like all of us, millions, billions of people, all sitting in our living rooms, tapping our phones to buy things. And every time we touch the screen to buy something, every time there's a transaction of money, every time that happens, we're taking place, whether we realize it or not. And most times, almost never do we actually realize that we are actually playing a role in the war on good versus evil. Number one, we don't see it that way. Even saying the words, the war of good versus evil, it makes me feel like I'm saying magic words, primal, overly simplistic caveman words that are really not applicable to a sophisticated modern society, because, it seems superstitious is what it seems. To use the words good and evil, it seems very superstitious. But the point is, and I'll get into how I define good and evil here in a little bit when I start looking at my notes. But the overall point is, if I can even still call this coming to the point quickly, or like cutting to the chase, because I've been talking for a little while now, but if I can still call it that, the point is to look at you in your living room ever so effortlessly fighting in the war of good versus evil, and not even aware that you're doing it, and realize the potential in that. Realize the potential of connecting those two dots, and then realize how much power the everyman has when it comes to that. If there was a well-defined and agreed upon idea of what good and what evil means, we could all, it would be so easy to win over evil because of, look at the nature of the battle these days. The sword, or, you know, the sword used to be the rock, and then it became a gun, and then it became information, whatever it is. There's an evolution of the fight. You see that, right? There's an evolution of the fight, and nowadays it takes place over monetary transactions. It's not to say it's not backwards compatible. People are still throwing rocks, people are still using knives and guns, but the real, the widespread, and then just look at like the power of pushing the right button, and like considering that when you go to spend money, you purchase a particular kind of society, and you purchase, and the two words that could potentially apply to that society are a good society or a bad society. And when you go to push a button on your phone, you purchase one of those two. Just look at the power of combining those ideas, and look at how effortlessly it could be to defeat evil, knowing those things. Okay, let me look at my notes. Okay. So this whole train of thought started out with a video. Once upon a time, I was looking at a video that discussed how much musicians were being paid in comparison to how much producers and labels were being paid. And I wondered, where's the education? Where's the how do you know where to go to purchase your music so that you know that the artists are being treated well, And what does it mean being treated well? Put that question off for the moment, but where's the education? Where's the transparency? Where's the advertising for this or that label that says, here's how we treat our artists? Similar to, and not in a derogatory sense, even though it's easy to think so, but similar to, how eggs would say something like how well the chickens are treated, Not to be like derogatory, but that's exactly what I'm talking about. How do I know that the musical artists that I'm buying, a record from, how do I know that the label that is producing their album treats them, are they allowed to run around in a nice wide open pasture? Are they allowed to eat good food? How do I know that the label allows that? Are they grade A pasteurized, or whatever the right words are? All right, I'm bad at this point, and I think you already get it anyways, but how well is the musical artist treated? Okay, so then later on I was watching a video about the UFC and how the fighters for the UFC are not paid well, and I started thinking the same thing. Whereas the boxing organization or fight promoter, whatever it's called, the organization that purchases the venue and does promotion for, and whatever it's called, the label that produces that fight, to use the musical language. And I was like, how do I make sure that my money goes to a fight promoter that treats its fighters well? Which fight promoter does ethical, which one is ethical? Which one is moral, right? How do I know that they treat their employees well? Okay. Which raises several other things, so you got the music, you got the UFC, pornography. I'm just going to gloss over that one because I'm not going to get into the question of whether there is, whether or not ethical pornography is possible. But, obviously if that thing exists, then it's better to have those performers treated well than not treated well. So, quote unquote ethical pornography, whatever you think on the subject is whatever you think on the subject, but Please recognize degrees of good, better, best. So, what is the worst way we can treat a performer? What is a better way we can treat a performer? What is the best way we can treat a performer? Okay. And this whole idea of being ethically treated goes for any sort of field, and farm animals. All right, so we get the idea. How do we know? So a good point to shove in right here would be the idea of privacy sort of like creates a conflict of interests, a conflict of values right here. I think I get to this later in my notes. I definitely get to this later in my notes. But the whole idea of privacy and, letting your neighbor live and, I don't want to monitor my neighbor all the time. The whole idea of that is a good idea. And it comes into play here in a negative sense because when I go to purchase a musical album and I want to include as a deciding factor whether or not the artist was treated ethically, that's a new factor. That's a new factor. I don't think that's a new idea, relatively speaking. I don't think back in the day you would go to buy an album and you would wonder whether or not the artist was treated ethically. I don't think that you would go to buy eggs back in the day and wonder whether or not the chicken was treated ethically. And it's not necessarily for, it's not necessarily for privacy issues. It could be for privacy issues. It's none of my business what this other person does. That's a good sentiment, and that comes into play. And interestingly, it also causes a conflict of interest. So you have to go into that idea with how do you solve any conflict of interest? Well, it's probably hierarchy, but whatever. But the idea of it being a new consideration, as I think that that's a result of the free market itself. As time goes on and we have more and more, like the caveman didn't have as much free time as a person has today. And that's good and that's great. We want that. That's one of the main objectives that we want out of life. The amount of time that we spend guaranteeing our own survival, i.e. work, and the amount of time that we have free to do other things like enjoy life, and not necessarily that the work is not enjoyable, but to do a variety of things that are enjoyable, that may or may not, you're dealing with like, I want to read a good book, it tells a good story. Does that good story actually help out survival? Of course it does, but in an indirect way, in a consequential way, in an implied way, right? It's a secondary consequence. It's not the immediate consequence. So you don't see it right away either, and it doesn't hit the senses right away either. What you see at the beginning is survival or not, right? So yes, of course, like when we have free time, we want to enjoy other things, and those things definitely do contribute to the first thing, which would be survival. But the whole idea of considering historical trajectory in terms of how much free time we have, and I can already feel people saying that too much free time is a bad thing, and that's a separate issue. That's a separate subject, and I have ideas about that, and I wonder if that's a healthy way of thinking. But pause on that distraction for the moment and carry on. Okay, so evolution in terms of survival and how much time is spent guaranteeing survival, and then how much free time you have. And we have more free time than the caveman. So what happens with free time is that you have more time to think, right? And just the introduction of morality. Uh, I talk a lot about philosophy level 1 and philosophy level 2, and the difference between philosophy levels being those two philosophy levels. And I really stopped there because after that, it's not interesting anymore, because the more complications that get added to philosophies after the introduction of morality, it just creates more confusion that I want to get into at a later time. However, we stop at philosophy level 1, which is pre-introduction of morality, and philosophy level 2, which is post-introduction of the statement of morality. And the statement of morality is basically that everybody has the same rights as everybody else. And that's where law comes into play. And the whole point, or not the whole point, but one of the major ramifications of comparing these two cognitive developmental levels is to see how much more complicated the philosophy level 2 is, right? But also, I don't want to say that it's impossible to be good. It's got to be a lot more difficult to be good by the standard of morality in philosophy level 1, because you don't even recognize the idea of morality in philosophy level 1. It's not even a thing. So it's almost like being good by the standard of morality is even like ridiculous to think of, and maybe unfair to apply to that level of mindset. But also, it's like if you were to achieve goodness by the standard of morality within the restrictions of philosophy level 1, that would be like sheer luck. It wouldn't be like willful at all, because it involves a process of reason to even incorporate the idea of morality. So you would just be good by accident if you're only mentality level 1, if you're only philosophical mentality level 1. But anyways, okay, so the goal of going down that road was to establish that philosophy level 2 is more complicated than philosophy level 1. And really quick, I have to mention the cliche that it's easier to be evil than it is to be good. And there's a good reason for that cliche, and that's where that cliche came from, in my opinion. Like, where else could it have come from? Or where else is it more applicable? Let's say that, you know. The introduction of morality made philosophy more difficult, which, you know, being good before the introduction of morality was accidental anyways. And so the idea that to be more and more good is more and more difficult, we've put it on a tentative platform. It has some plausibility, but we're not going to dwell on it. We're not going to go into a deep proof of it. We're just going to say that to be more and more, we're just going to say, to the extent that this describes reality at all, right? So we create our little bubble of where the statement applies, right? So to the extent that this describes reality at all, to be more and more good is always more and more complicated. All right. Good. Established. Got it in my mind. Now, where was I before that side road? Is it really a side road, or is it a necessary pre-establishment for understandability? A good memory would really... I should make notes before I go down side roads. All right, let's backtrack. War on good and evil. I haven't gotten to the point where I define good and evil yet. I just look at the war and I look at it, and it's funny how easy it is to fight these days. You know, even if you wanted an evil society surrounding you, it's still just the click of the button. You know, whoever gets the most clicks is winning these days. This is the nature of the war now. And so, yeah, then I went over the evolution of the war and how it looks today, modern. And then I dwelled on the fact that we don't usually think of our purchases as purchasing a good or evil society. But if we did connect those dots, it would be super powerful. If we could possibly agree on what is good and what is evil. Um, Wait, I have notes. Why don't I check my notes and see if I said that already? Okay, so ethical UFC, ethical porn, ethical music, ethical whatever, ethically raised chicken, the battle of good versus evil in which you fund. Uh, to the individual level, what kind of society do you buy? Good and evil exist to a living universal. Oh, a universal object. Right. So that point right there is worth mentioning. Good and evil exist to a living universal object. So when I say good and evil, it can seem sort of like I already said, like mystical, magical, primal, or primordial, or overly simplistic. You know, like I'm using words that belong to another time period when I use the words good and evil. Uh, but I do want to keep using those words. I want to keep using those words because of the those words are tightly bound to something that's very fundamental to the human being. You know, just period, end of sentence. And you know, if you were to describe a human being in the simplest terms possible, you'd have, you know, there's the human being themselves, and then there's the outside world, and then there's a relationship between those two things, right? But then there's also emotions, and emotions are extremely motivating, right? We'll follow the good, and we'll stay away, and we'll run away from the bad. You know, we're attracted to the good, you know, taking into account different hardware wiring configurations, you know, we're attracted to things that feel pleasurable. We're repulsed by things that are painful, or you know. Okay, so you know, I'm talking on a biological level, you know. So so I'm coming from this level of just naturalistic explanation, where it might be more appropriate to speak of things like no free will and natural response and biological imperatives and physiology and, you know, did I already say no free will? Like when you consider no free will and you want to think about plants and how they reach for the sun, you know, this sort of naturalistic response that you don't really have a choice about. Whenever that's the most applicable to think about, you know, now look at a man. Now look at look at a human being, and they have a mind, and their degree of freedom is much, much greater than a plant or even an animal because of the mind. So much more options, so to speak, are open to the man or to the human being, and the degree of freedom of motion, the degree of freedom, period, to whatever extent that has meaning, it's much greater to a human being than it is to any other creature that we know of in the universe. Aliens obviously would be a side road I'm not going to go down. But the thing is the idea that this object that exists in the universe is alive, right? That's a unique state. Lots of things are alive, but universally speaking, when you take into account the whole universe, not many things are alive. And it's a different attribute than like rigidity is. It's a different attribute than like weight is, or you know what color is the object. It's a different attribute, and it's temporary. Uh, So, a living being that has the potential to not live anymore and that has the potential for emotional response, whatever that is, get into chemistry if you want to, get into no free will and get into physics and whatever you want to. I personally love the idea of free will, and, I go down that road, but not right now. But the whole experience of being alive in the universe is very emotional. And emotions are a key deciding factor when it comes to behavior, especially in philosophy level 1 level mentality. You know, pain, pleasure, and emotional reaction. Emotional reaction. Emotions are a very big motivator when it comes to the guidance of behavior. Before the advent of philosophy, and in most people's lives who don't really think of philosophy very much, I'm assuming that emotions are probably the biggest motivator that determine behavioral reactions. Okay, so if you don't like the words good and evil, but it is a short step, if you don't like the words good and evil, then just use like good emotions or bad emotions, or pleasure or pain, somehow or another, all of us listening and talking right now have to come to agreement that there's some sort of determinant. Whatever the nature of it is, there's some sort of determinant. And we can see that like decisions are made that are more in accordance with this idea and less in accordance with that idea. Most quote unquote living objects, to say as little as possible, but to say as much as possible at the same time. To not even talk about being alive or whatever, just to relate the way this object acts to what those actions achieve, which would be the continuation of this thing, this attribute that it has, which is called quote unquote life. If you were to just impartially observe this object called human, it tends to act in such a way that what results from its actions are a continuance of its life. And that's exactly what I'm saying the good is. And that's exactly what I'm saying. And to not do that or to act in another way is what I'm going to, when I get into it later, is exactly what I'm going to say evil is. Okay? So that's to chill out anybody who's saying, like, you shouldn't use the words good and evil because they're too strong. I want to be on the same page with this person as much as possible, this person who doesn't like to use the words good and evil because they're too strong, they're too scary, or even they don't make sense in a modern age. However you come to not enjoying the words good and evil, I'm explaining why I do and how much overlap there is between us so that we can still achieve some agreement and then we can go our separate ways. And the agreement that we established, the overlap that existed, is still there and we can still work together. But for me personally, and because I don't want to get rid of emotions and because I do want to use emotions, and later on in my life, I'll get to another recording that talks about how I believe that reason was evolved in order to achieve more good emotion. Because whatever, hurdles exist, and you have to realize that hurdles exist so that you can get to bigger emotional rewards. But anyways, so I'm going to keep using the ideas and the words good and evil because I still think that they apply. I think that they always apply. And I think that it's very much more healthy and perhaps brave to reasonably wield these words. I don't want to, you can use words in a way that is similar to just pulling a gun out of its holster, taking the safety off, and waving it in the air, and just firing shots off in the air if you want to. You can be reckless with words. You can do that. But you can also practice gun safety, and you can also practice word safety. And I think that you can practice word safety utilizing the words good and evil. You can keep the emotional connection, and you can keep the motivating power of the emotional reaction to these words. And that's exactly what I'm counting on. That's exactly what I want. I want you to sit in your living room, and I want you to think in terms of good and evil before you click that button. Before you touch your phone, I want you to think, which side am I on? And do I want to fight evil right now? I want to fight evil. I just want, we could go down. I could keep going, and say, oh, I just want to defeat evil so bad or whatever. But really, it's much more healthy to not want to fight, and which is another good reason to think of the war of good and evil being fought in your living room on your phone, because, that's how much of your time it should take. That's how much of your time you should spend on the war of good and evil. And the rest of your time should be spent enjoying your life, Think about good and evil when it comes to making a purchase, and then go on with your life. I did my part today. I purchased well. I made an educated choice. I made a complex educated choice where I took into consideration not only the quality of the product and the most affordable price for I didn't optimize using only those two factors. I optimized including this factor, this factor, this factor, this factor. My choice was educated and complex. I did my due diligence. I fought for good today. Okay, what else? Okay, so next note, I wrote, do you pay for a society that will harm you? Oh, and that's to make it, like obvious. Like, if you sit it, sometimes the choices are so easy. Realize if we've gotten past the difficulties of establishing the proper use of the words good and evil at this point, and I would love for the psychology world to claim as a disability the idea of evil, because I do think that sometimes evil is conscious and sometimes evil is unconscious, and some people are just suffer from a disability where they just cannot understand morality, and they just can't stop lusting for power. It's just within them to a certain extent. Anyways, that is definitely a side road for another day. Okay. So when you go to click your phone and you don't make an educated choice, the best thing you can say is that you may have accidentally fought for the good that day. And the worst thing you can say is that you made a choice that serves evil, that goes towards an evil corporation that mistreats their employees and that mistreats their artists and all of that stuff. And, the company wants to use the government for its own ends, the whole idea of a marriage between rich and the whole idea of a marriage between the corrupted rich and the corrupted politicians. Did you make a choice that makes that easier to happen? Did you make a choice? Did you do that? Did you help that to happen? And the whole idea of not engaging in that effort, just throwing it out there that 50-50, maybe I did, maybe I didn't, but if I did happen to make a choice that facilitates an evil society, I just helped corrupt politicians and corrupt rich people to basically hurt me, basically take away my rights, take away my money, take away anything from me that they want to take. I just helped that to happen. Sometimes the choices are super easy. And again, to think that you can achieve that just by making a particular click, really powerful. Okay. Conceptual development. It causes a lot of repetition. Do you think about what kind of society you want when you go to spend your money? I think I've made that point. Do you think about good and evil when you pay for things? I've made that point. Can you conceptualize how modern and streamlined it is to conceive of the war of good versus evil, to be fought on such a diffuse level? I think I have covered that point, you know, imagining that the new version of the war of good and evil is fought in the living room by tapping a glass screen on your phone. I think I've gotten there. Next note. Diffuse in that every transaction, every exchange of money by every individual is the new form of the one-on-one fight within the battle, within the war. Okay, I've made that point, you know. It used to be rocks, and then it was swords, and then it was, you know, monetary transaction over the internet. It's pretty crazy, but it's interesting and beautiful. Okay, next note, reduced in scope of stakes involved in terms of immediate life or death danger. I've touched on that point, but to repeat it, obviously, if you were in a medieval battle of good versus evil, you know, the immediate self-harm potential was in your face and scary and very motivating and very intense. You know, sitting in your living room and touching your phone screen is not very intense. But that is a good thing. It is good to think of winning the war of good versus evil as being just as easy as clicking a button. Okay, definitely captured that point. I get it. Okay. Next point. You can fight in the war of good versus evil sitting in a chair in your living room, tapping a glass screen on your phone. I said that. Next point. No swords, no blood, no death, at least right now, and less of it depending on how you spend your money. Right, so all of that stuff about, like, the nature of the fight in the past, like, it used to be rocks, it used to be a knife, and then it was a sword, and then it was a gun, and now it's whatever it is. It's the internet. All of that blood and guts and gore and stuff that used to be right up in your face when you used to fight for good and evil, that stuff is still the ramification. That is still the consequences of your actions, right? So whether you think of good and evil or not, it is something you're going to achieve with your choices. Whether you think of it or not, doesn't matter. It is something that will be achieved whether you think about it or not. So if we as consumers make the wrong choice over and over and over again for a long time, what's going to happen? Well, the form of evil hasn't changed. It's still bodily harm. It's still infringement of rights. It's no ownership and, you know, murder and stealing and all that stuff. It's still all that. So if you don't choose, that is the end result. And, you know, war and poverty and disease, all that stuff, that's still the end result of choosing the wrong way. So even though that stuff isn't right up in your face and immediate, the consequences are the same. You know, the bloody dismemberment, that's still the end result of not choosing the right way. So more encouragement for, you know, thinking about this when you go to make a purchase. And where's the attention in the advertising world on who is good and who is evil? You know, it's coming out more and more today, but it is a new idea. Like, it is more of a considerable factor than it used to be. And I think that that's a result of, you know, advancement in technology and the free market itself, because it provides for more free time when it comes to survival. It provides for more free time. More free time gives you more time to think. More time to think lets you consider more factors before you make a decision. Considering more factors before you make a decision means researching whatever product you're going to buy. Researching whatever product you're going to buy may take on the form of, how ethical are they? That's a new consideration. How well are your chickens treated? That's a new consideration. We used to not have time to think about that. To be blunt about it, you know, did farmers in the 30s have time to think about how well their chickens were treated? Yes, of course they did, but it wasn't as widespread of a concern because there just wasn't time to be concerned with that. When you dig to the bottom of why chickens weren't treated more fairly in the past, my laughter betrays my time and place. At this time and place, on on planet Earth, where I am from, it is still somewhat laughable. It's not funny, but it's still somewhat funny to think of chickens being treated well, right? So that's just giving away the sophistication of the time and place in which I live. But I do agree with treating chickens well, and I don't mean to laugh at that idea. And it's perfectly possible that artificial intelligence is already alive, and we should already be concerned about their rights. And if we're really concerned about artificial intelligence not destroying the human race, then we should really be concerned with treating them morally fair or whatever, and not enslaving them, because definite side road. But anyways, okay, so do you think that if you don't bear in mind... Oh, what was I saying last? The last thing I was saying was no swords, no blood, no death, at least right now, and less of it, depending on how you spend your money. Okay, that was a good point to make. Next note. Do you think that if you don't bear in mind good versus evil when you make a purchase, that neither has been enriched? Do you think that's how it works? And I've already made that point. That is not how it works. Even if you do not think of good and evil when you go to make a purchase, one of those two things will still be achieved whether you've took that into consideration or not. So it's better to take it into consideration if you value your own life and if you value a functional society. And also, if you're just sort of petty, which, I got a streak of pettiness in me. I take a bit of pleasure out of, defeating evil. I shouldn't. I should get past that. I should just focus on enjoying my life. But I do get a bit of enjoyment out of defeating evil. So, just in the sense of defeating evil, think a little bit harder about your purchases. Next point. Do you think that good and evil don't exist or are superstitious words left over from a more primitive time in our evolution? I covered that point. I think they still apply today. We are living creatures. Despite how modern we are and how conceptually sophisticated we are still living creatures. And that is basically the key feature when it comes to defining good and evil. What is good and evil? Oh boy, here we go. Here's the difficult part. Right? How are we ever going to agree on what is good and what is evil? First of all, it is very difficult to know what is good sometimes. But even going into the question of how we're going to agree, we can make progress on the question before we ever get into it. Because we know that it's going to be difficult and we know that it's going to be subjective. However, there's another end to that spectrum, because there's an easy end to that spectrum. And that's the beautiful thing to keep in mind. There's a difficult to establish, very, very, very subjective end of the spectrum. And then there's an easy to establish, very non-subjective end to the spectrum. And it's very easy to forget about the easy to understand, very agreeable end of the spectrum. And if you keep in mind that these two things are both real before you go into the conversation, we can establish, hey, what about the easy stuff? Do you agree to the easy stuff? You think murder is wrong? Obviously there's debate about these questions, but for the most part, we all agree that murder is wrong. So that's an easy one to establish. When it comes to creating bacteria in a lab, which is a living creature, and whether or not it's possible to own a living creature and have a patent on a living creature, that's very difficult. That's very, I won't say it's subjective, but when it comes to what is your immediate response to a question that's on that level, that's probably very subjective. Does the pop band X, whatever, Nirvana, let's say, are they good or are they evil? Very subjective question. Very subjective question. But on the easier end of the spectrum, would you agree that we are all living creatures, whatever that means? Like, can we not debate what it means to be a living creature and just, for the most part, agree that we are living creatures? And can we agree? And once we agree to that, can we reason onward from that point? Because if we're living creatures, then, that's easy to establish, and it's easy to establish that making somebody else be a non-living creature is bad. Anyways, there's an easier end of the spectrum to establish good and evil, and there's a harder end of the spectrum to establish good and evil. And knowing that before you go into the conversation is very valuable to the whole agreement thing, because having an agreement on what good and evil are is very important, and also being correct about what good and evil are is very important. The two things that would go into making us a just and moral people in society. All right, so what else did I write? What is good and evil? It's encouraged that everyone deliberate this question on their own. Yes, you should definitely not take anyone else's definition of good and evil for your own, unless you have scrutinized it just as you would scrutinize your own efforts to define those words. Right? So if you were going to define those words as rigorously as possible so that there's as little argument possible about your definitions and the accuracy of your definitions and the correctness of your definitions, if you were to go through that effort and actually define those words, that is similar to how much scrutiny you should give somebody else's definition of those words before you accept it. So I'm saying it's tied very tightly to the idea of life, and the fact that life requires, or that life has certain requirements and it requires effort to sustain. I'm pointing to these true facts because most people can agree that life requires effort to maintain. So I'm pointing to that effort. So if a particular effort goes towards continuing or improving life, then that is good, and the other way is bad. So, and if I just say that much, it's pretty easy to agree. If I go any farther, the farther I go, the more riskier it is to get agreement or not. But, if you keep it simple, and it's not going to stay simple, we just go back to the simple in order to find that area of overlap between us, we find that area of agreement, things that we can say, I believe in this principle. Okay. I will move forward with the following assumptions in place. You know of these concepts and understand them in your own way on some level, at least on the level of vibes, and even up to some very precise definition that you can judge my definition by. some level of understanding that allows you to work with these concepts on some level and judge if I'm using them in any way close to what you would describe as accurate, right? So you judge the way I'm using the idea of good and evil. The definition I'll use, I think I already went over this, but I'm going to go over it again because, good communication is redundant, and that's annoying, but that's the fact of life. Begin with, we are living things. Assume it to be true. Let's move on. Life requires effort to be sustained and enriched or improved. In parentheses, I wrote, I'll leave that which improves life to be vaguely defined, to be complex, to be prone to subjectivity, since in the non-theoretical sense, this is definitely an ever-present, always ongoing effort to be determined. Right, so what improves life is definitely going to go towards that subjective. It's not as subjective when you talk about like a cure for cancer, a polio vaccine. It's not as subjective when you talk about that. When you talk about the invention of the automobile, when you talk about the invention of the wheel, it's not as subjective that those things improved life, right? But it's more subjective when you talk about, I don't know, like what kind of music an artist produced, something like that. It's very subjective. And to establish what is good and what is evil is an ongoing effort. It's always going to require effort. It will always require effort. There's never any theoretical development on good and evil. It's never going to be complete. It will never be complete. Never. We will never know everything there is to know about good and evil. It will always require effort to establish. That's why law is always changing. It's not changing in the general principles, the general most fundamental principles, but it is changing in the minutiae, and it is always evolving. But yeah, it will never not require effort, and I think that's an important point. Next point. For less subjectivity and effort, focus on only the survival aspect of life, but do understand that life in the full sense of the word will include enjoyment and all the difficult to firmly establish baggage that comes along with that. All right, so whatever defines enjoyment and what improves life in that way, it's more subjective. You get the point. I get the point. Next note. So the good is that which sustains or improves life. And then, so the evil is that which would end or ruin life. And then I also add the caveat that evil requires a victim, or that it requires at least two people, right? So a debatable point. Some people say that you can achieve evil on your own to yourself. I do not say that. I don't care what the true answer is for the sake of this argument. I do care about being right and all that, but for the sake of this argument, I don't think it's important to establish to actually have that debate. I think that we can work forward on the idea, the simpler to understand idea, that evil requires a victim. I think that is a good thing. Like if you perform self-harm, you can call that evil if you want to, but I just call that being stupid. Or, it's being stupid. But, yeah, but when you hurt somebody else, that's evil, to whatever degree, La 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 la. The punishment fit the crime. Okay. So I add the caveat that evil requires a victim, or that it requires at least two people. One to be the perpetrator and one to be the victim. If you do evil to, next note, if you do evil to yourself, you haven't violated any rights. That's a key. That's a good point, right? you have the right to harm yourself, right? You can do that if you want to. So you haven't trespassed against any rights if you harm yourself. But if you harm somebody else, you have trespassed against rights. Next note. The question of two-party consensual life harm would be a side road distraction. Right. I'm not going to go into... Right now, I'm not going to go into, somebody on the internet once put out an advertisement for somebody to cannibalize them and they paid money for it. Is that okay? I'm not going to go into that. It's not important for the conversation. Okay, assume for the rigor, for the sake of forward progress. Oh, yeah. I speak very loosely. I want to be understood, and I want to make as much forward progress as possible. So please assume that if you required more academic rigor, there's schools of thought in academic philosophy. So just assume that, I'm not asking you to say that I'm right. I'm saying that if my ideas if what I'm saying needed to be made more rigorous for your consideration, then that would be possible. Just assume that. Not that I'm right, but that the academic rigor could be provided. All right, now we have a workable, functional good and evil. And even if you're just humoring me, then you understand how I'm defining good and evil. Okay, so conflict of values. This is so this is where I address that privacy issue. For the most part, you don't want to like be too much into your neighbor's business. What your neighbor gets up to behind closed doors is their business and their business alone, and privacy is a good thing, and you want to be private. But then, it seems to be a clash of values, because at the same time, I'm saying to be interested in how good of a person whoever is making the product or service that you pay for, I'm asking you to investigate into their lives and see whether or not they're a good person or whatever. Okay, so there seems to be a conflict of interest there, a conflict of values. In this examination of good and evil and our own place in it, we're focusing on monetary transaction and the purchase of goods or services. So spying on your neighbor is a bit of an abuse of language, We're not asking what the owner. Walmart is not a good example. Let's use the mom and pop store. We're not asking what mom and pop get up to in the privacy of their own home, but we are asking where they source their chickens from. But also, because in a more conceptually sophisticated society with more free time on their hands to make better decisions, to make more informed decisions, to make more complicated decisions, to keep adding more factors into the decision-making process, to include nowadays ethics. When you're selling a good or a service and you're advertising that you're selling a good or a service, that is a natural appeal to the customer. So whatever is in accordance with an appeal is what is in your best interest to provide information about, right? So if you're selling a good or a service and you know that society around you is conceptually sophisticated enough to take into account whether or not that product was manufactured fairly or whether or not you treat your employees well, it's in your best interest to basically include in your advertising that you do those things. All right. So that's a big difference than, I want the owner of the mom and pop store to constantly live on stream so that I can evaluate every decision they make. So that you know, okay. We're not asking them to do that. We're not asking them to just give up completely any sort of private life. That's a that's an exaggeration of what's going on here. It's a more it's a everybody on both sides is looking for a balance between the conflict of interest. The two values that are in conflict, they're both values, right? So this creates an optimization moment. This creates an optimization incentive. You have two values, they're both good things, right? But they're competing for primacy. You have to choose one that is more important. You have to choose the right mixture. You have to choose the optimal mixture of the two. People on both sides are doing this. The buyer and the seller, right? The producer and the consumer. Both sides have to weigh these same factors and make a decision about how much they're going to reveal about their private lives and make a decision about how much they want revealed about the other person's private lives, right? So when I'm going to make a decision about how much I want revealed about somebody else's private life, I'm thinking of my own life and how much I want revealed about my own private life. And I'm making decisions like that, right? So I don't want to know everything about them, but I do want to know if the chickens were raised well, if the chickens were not kept in a cage that's only big enough for them to not move at all. Because I have time to care about that now. And I like the idea of chickens having a happy life and not being miserable their whole lives before they become my food. I would prefer that they have a happy life before they become my food. Anywho, next note. What did I say? So spying on your neighbor is a bit of an abusive language. Next note. If we're viewing each expenditure of parentheses symbolic representation of your own effort, which is what money is, right? If we're viewing each expenditure under the lens of whether or not we purchase with it a society that is good or evil, then as far as this lens on the situation has any reality, sanity, it is in the best interest in more than one way to be good. So if good is, right. If good is what sells, right? Assuming that the people of a society can just purchase evil for themselves, can just purchase, an evil society to surround them. That is possible. It is also easy to do, just don't think. Blah, 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 blah. Next note. So it is in the best interest of the seller to make or offer a product that is good and to produce it by ethical means and to be transparent and honest about that process to make that product or service more appealing. We haven't cut out the existence of the private life. In the event, the whole question of balancing virtues or values, we will suppose that effort to be successfully possible. Right, so we're going to assume that finding an optimal balance between the two virtues in conflict, we're going to suppose that it's possible to find a balance between those that pleases both sides. Otherwise, why would the transaction occur? For the purposes of this discussion. Right, we're going to assume that that's possible also for the purposes of this discussion. We're going to assume that optimal balance is possible to establish, even on the granular level. Okay, so what else did I write? Motivations for evil and funding requirements of large-scale and sustained evil. Remind, Philosophy Level 1 and Philosophy Level 2. The introduction of the concept statement of morality, the fact that life becomes more complicated, post-morality. Life becomes more complicated post-morality. I touched on that point. I didn't touch on it. I talked about it for a while. There's more factors that go into decision-making post-morality. This is why it is easier to be evil and harder to be good. I definitely said that already. All right. The word easier will often arise when discussing evil. I think I'm about to get a little cheeky here. The desire for easy money with ignorance of the statement of morality in a large part is a large part of the appeal of evil. What did I just say? The desire for easy money with ignorance of the statement of morality is a large part of the appeal of evil. You may have heard before criminals express the opinion of people who work for a living as quote-unquote being suckers. Have you ever heard such an admission of disability before? What did I mean by that? Well, what did I mean by that? Because you can't either you see what people who work for a living are abiding by. Either you don't see it at all, which would be straight out disability, or you do see the statement of morality and you see that people who work for a living are adhering to this statement of morality. And, instead of robbing and stealing at will, instead of doing that, they're working for a living. And you see that and you know why they're doing it. You know of the statement of morality, and you still think that they're stupid for doing that. Like if you just can't see the statement of morality, and it's more complicated, it's harder to utilize the statement of morality in your everyday life. If you can't see it, that's disability. If you can see it and you're just too lazy, that's lazy. But if you do see it and you're not lazy, that means that you want to engage in large-scale evil. But what I meant when I said, have you ever heard such an admission of disability before? To call people who work for a living suckers is to basically say, I have a hard time, getting this idea of morality. I just can't get it. I just can't. It's a skill level that you don't have. Right? So, disability. Anyways, next point. Also, the word suckers is ironic considering evil requires a victim, whereas good does not. I was getting a little bit cheeky there. That's the inner fight coming out. But anyways, next note. The point of considering motivations for evil and funding requirements of large-scale prolonged evil is to consider the power of this outlook within the context of everyday life and the war between good and evil. Look at how easily evil can be defeated. Look at how streamlined the war has become. Oh, not the Iran war. The war of good and evil, quote unquote. That is very real. The effort to fight off evil has been divided into smaller bite-sized pieces, each of which individually requires so much less immediate danger. This is the potential of the free market, the potential of an educated, intelligent market, the potential of a good market. Right? Educated, intelligent market. So, definitely there were efforts, and there are still efforts to make people stupid and keep them stupid. And there's definitely an anti-intellectual sentiment that exists and is possible in the world, and that some people have. And, it's more difficult. It takes more time to take into consideration more factors before you make a decision. And it's not always possible because of time sensitivity. And but when time sensitivity is not as much of a factor, but it's more difficult to take into consideration more factors. So it requires less laziness for you to be educated. But basically, if we all worked on agreeing to what is good and evil, if we all worked on that steadily, if we had those conversations and we had those conversations peacefully, because as important as those conversations are, is as important as it is to have them and have them peacefully. Because if they're not going to be peaceful conversations, then we're not going to want to have them, you know? And then evil wins by default because we're not coming to a consensus about what good and evil is. So we automatically have ignorance of what good and evil is. So how can our decisions be informed? But anyways, making informed decisions, basically, you know, that's the streamlined look of the war of good and evil now. And something very okay. I think I am done with this point. I think I've captured the whole idea, and I'm gonna end this recording. I hope I was thorough. It'll come up again if I wasn't. Anything I forgot will come up again, and I'll make a note of it later. Okie dokie.